A top health policy expert, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya is one of the most prominent faces that emerged during the COVID pandemic. The US-based doctor spoke out against the mainstream narrative and policy decisions during the pandemic.
There was no beginning or ending.
He co-authored a letter in 2020, the Great Barrington Declaration, which stated how damaging the lockdowns were. He wrote the letter with Indian-born British epidemiologist Dr. Sunetra Gupta and former professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, Martin Kulldorff. The declaration proposed herd immunity as a solution, not lockdowns. He instantly became an internet sensation. The Stanford professor joined Twitter in 2021, but was soon blacklisted by the social media platform for taking the side of science. In December, he was invited by Elon Musk and was promised the issue would be taken up. Elon Musk also once famously replied to one of his tweets with a cryptic answer, "The sun is coming," which triggered wild guesses on the internet. A professor of medicine and a top infectious disease policy expert at Stanford University for the last 22 years, Dr. Bhattacharya has left his home city Kolkata when he was 4.
So I was born in Kolkata, back when it was called Calcutta in 1968. My father had applied for a visa lottery because he had been a student in the U.S. He won the visa lottery. He applied before he was married, before I was born, won the visa lottery. And in 1971, we moved to the United States. My mom grew up in Kolkata, also in Kirpur, just this very poor area. And then I came to the U.S. when I was 4, and I basically have grown up in the States.
Dr. Bhattacharya's Great Barrington Declaration was the most talked about statement on the pandemic in recent times. You are one of the few doctors who actually countered the mainstream narrative during the pandemic. What kind of difficulties did you face from your close circles at the university? Very briefly, could you please tell us about that struggle?
It was tremendously stressful. I teach at Stanford University in the medical school, and have taught us here for 22 years, 21 years. And so I've been a long-term researcher here, and even though I have been known around the university for health policy, and I've done a tremendous amount of infectious disease policy work before the pandemic, on a number of infectious disease policy topics, the university treated me very poorly. It made my life very difficult, including at one point demanding that I stop speaking with the press. There was a poster campaign trying to suggest that my argument for focused protection of vulnerable people had somehow caused deaths, and they put pictures of somebody put pictures of me all over campus accusing me of this. The university never platformed a debate between me and other people on the campus who may have disagreed with me. Despite some efforts by former leaders of the university, the current leaders did not allow that debate to occur on campus.
I'm a little bit conservative to call it a pandemic, because as far as I have seen in India, there was little impact of this disease in the rural areas and in the slum areas, in the congested areas. Only the gated communities were very badly affected. So if we go by the definition of pandemic, because I'm a layman, I don't know what is the exact definition of a pandemic, but if you go by the definition of pandemic, would you call it a pandemic as far as India is concerned?
If you ask what a particular scientific definition of pandemic is, there really isn't one. It's a decision made by public health authorities, usually international public health authorities. And the World Health Organization actually doesn't even have the language to call it a pandemic. They call it a infectious disease of international concern or something. So to me, the language is not so important. It is a fact that there is COVID-19 spreading in many countries, and it has caused the deaths of many, especially older people. And in India, you are absolutely right. What happened in India is that there was two different threats. In poor places, it spread everywhere, but didn't cause so much death. In part because a lot of the people who live in those poor places tend to be younger. This disease has a 1,000-fold difference in the risk of death. If you're older, it's much more risky. I think this idea of dividing the population into clean and unclean. Can you stay away from the virus? It was always a mistake. In public health and medicine, we should never moralize disease. It's not a sin to get COVID. It's not a virtue to be able to have the resources to be able to hide yourself away and stay away from it.
We have traveled extensively in India after this lockdown and after this devastation. So I can tell you that lockdown has brought apartheid, a real apartheid in India. People have been split into class, based on their vaccination status, and this new division seems permanent.
I hope it's not permanent. I hope we can go back. But I do agree with you that if you think about what the primary philosophy of lockdown approaches that we used, the idea is that other people are biohazards biohazards that we need to avoid. Other people are unclean. The central animating idea of lockdown is this division between clean and unclean.
Mm-hmm.
Clean means that you will have the capacity to stay home and stay safe. Clean means that you wear a mask, even though the mask doesn't really protect anybody against getting COVID or spreading it. Clean means that you're vaccinated and you have some card to prove that you're vaccinated. Clean and unclean is the opposite of each of those things. But if you think about what that actually means, none of those things actually protect you against getting COVID or spreading it. Even people who locked themselves away for 2 years eventually got COVID. It is a highly infectious disease that is the common now inheritance of all mankind. Everyone will get COVID at some point in their lives, probably multiple times in their lives. It is not a marker of lack of cleanliness. It's not a it's not a marker of moral purity just because you have the money or resources to stay away from it. So I think it's a tremendously classist approach to the pandemic, this lockdown approach to the pandemic. And in India, it exacerbates inequalities that were already bad, and essentially launches them into the next generation. It's not richer kids that suffered the most from 2 years of loss of school, although they did suffer. It's poorer kids, many of whom didn't have access to Zoom, live in areas where there's load shedding, didn't have access to technology, essentially lost two full years of school because of and that will cause much more health harms over their lifetimes than the pandemic ever would.
But we followed the same template as in the Western countries.
No, I mean, in fact, that is the crucial and critical point. The right way to deal with this threat it depends on the local circumstances. Mm-hmm. And copying the same template everywhere, it was an enormous mistake. And in India in particular, it was an enormous mistake. Many places in India closed schools for almost 2 full years.
Yes.
The devastating impact on the next generation of children in India that will be less well educated as a consequence. It will have knock-on consequences for the rest of their lives. Mm-hmm. The way that India managed the pandemic essentially was influenced very sharply by Western epidemiology, Western approaches to the pandemic. I have to say the Western approach to the pandemic wasn't very effective. Mm-hmm. And I think when India adopted these approaches, it made it a tremendous mistake. There were other ways to manage the pandemic that better understood the local living circumstances of people in India, that would have reduced the death toll, that would have reduced the collateral harm, which include tremendous poverty and a large number of people thrown into food insecurity, hunger. Mm-hmm. The less economic and impact and all of the knock-on health consequences from that economic impact could have been avoided had India adopted a very different approach to the pandemic.
Who did the lockdowns mainly benefit?
The lockdowns benefit the laptop class. The set of people who do not lose their jobs if they are if the world locks down, right? You can do your job by Zoom. I mean, frankly, I'm a professor at a big university. It benefited me, right? I could do my job by Zoom, and I didn't have to lose it. I argued sort of very hard against the lockdowns, because I knew that it would damage everybody else on Earth. In the United States, that laptop class is maybe 30% or 20% of the population. In India, it's maybe 1, 2, 3% of the population.
Yes. Going back to the origin of the virus, do you still believe that the virus came from a lab? It was a lab leak theory. Do you still believe in that?
Well, so I don't know for certain. I mean, if an animal pops up, and they find some animal with something that looks like a very close intermediate host, I'll change my mind. But from what I'll tell you, I think the people who would know best, people like Tony Fauci and Francis Collins, about the support of this kind of work, of gain of function work, they covered up the possibility of a lab leak. Let's say it's a lab leak. What the question is why? Why were they studying a virus this dangerous in a lab?
Yes.
The justification I've heard is that these kinds of experiments are needed to predict which viruses will make the leap from animals to people. And so you have to go into the wild, go into bat caves, find viruses there, bring into the lab, mutate them, and see how close they are to being able to infect human cells. And then based on that, you can get vaccines very rapidly. That's the justification people give. The question, the harm is the possibility that the virus leaks out of the lab into broad populations. I think that even if it was an animal origin virus, the program of trying to predict pandemic viruses that have pandemic potential has failed. It didn't work this time, obviously. And this virus has actually leaked from labs. That's documented for instance, in Taiwan in 2021. There was a group studying this in a high security lab in Taiwan, and it leaked out of that Taiwanese lab, causing a local outbreak. It's a dangerous activity, and that dangerous activity may be justified if it produces some benefit for mankind. But as best I can tell, the virologists that engage in this activity have not made a good argument to say that this can be done safely, or even that there is a large enough benefit to warrant the risk. So my view is that that we don't yet have definitive proof, although it seems likely based on the biochemical evidence I've seen that it was a lab leak. But even if you don't believe that, the case for continuing this kind of research has not been made. In fact, it is a pretty good case, I believe, to be made that this research should not be permitted. I mean, I would favor an international treaty limiting this kind of research.
This is where censorship comes. I mean, that is the reason we were also the victim of big tech censorship, and you were censored several times by Twitter. I mean, what does this expose? Why this zero tolerance over information?
So the censorship, I think that the heart of it is hubris on the part of scientific bureaucrats who advise governments about the COVID response. There were bureaucrats like Tony Fauci, who in their view were so smart, so well informed, so strongly in possession of the truth that anyone who disagreed with them, in a sense, was lying, was causing tremendous harm.
Yeah.
And so they used the power that they had to suppress dissent in order to create an illusion of consensus around their opinion. Right? The idea, for instance, that the lockdowns could somehow protect us from the disease, that the lockdowns weren't causing a tremendous harm, school closures were necessary. They suppressed dissent because if they had allowed it, the public at large would have understood that there was a lot of conflict within the scientific community itself regarding what the right strategy is. but because they were in power and they could scare governments into adopting deeply illiberal policies that censored the speech, violated civil liberties, and it was very difficult to push back. I mean, it's you yourself, I know, have faced it. I've faced it. Any dissent was met with this idea that if you dissent, you're saying and doing something dangerous. But I'd say that censorship, that itself was dangerous, that it caused tremendous harm because it allowed policies to go forward that would otherwise have never had a chance to go forward if it had been met equally on the battlefield of ideas.
Hope they don't take down this interview. Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya. It was a very powerful conversation with you. Hope to have more such conversations in future as well. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to talk with you.